I went to the NDT 4 times, and I won a SETA national championship, and I did it all arguing a lot in favor of and against potential war scenarios, which there are many, and they are ever-changing. Since then, I have pursued getting a PhD in international relations. I'm 4/5 of the way through that. And although the focus of my dissertation is management of the environment, war scenarios always come up because the truth is we do live in an anarchic international system where there is no central governing authority that can choose to pursue peace by preventing wars between states that have a reason to go to war. So this is what I'm going to go over. It is condensed into about 24 slides, so hopefully I don't talk too much on any individual one of them. I wanted to talk generically about what it means to say that a war is possible, and I think there are some really strong general arguments that really haven't been fully taken advantage of by the debate community in terms of generic defense against the possibility of interstate wars. And then I just chose the scenarios that I think are most likely to occur, or more importantly, there's most likely to be a lot of evidence about these potential war scenarios. And I'll explain to you why I didn't pursue other particular scenarios. And then I just got a couple of comments at the end, pet peeves about the way people typically argue that a war scenario is likely, and this just to clarify what realism means and give you some arguments to make when people call you a realist and use that as a link to a K of your war scenario impact. So different types of war. There is no consensus definition of war. Colloquially, we tend to mean interstate conflict, but as you know, there is such thing as civil war, militarized conflict within the bounds of a territorial state. The notion of war as an interstate militarized conflict is the one I'm going to sort of roll with because it's what most of the literature, by which I mean popular media, but also scholarly literature, assumes that a war is. But it's sort of implicit within that definition of war is the idea that the territorial state system, which is the dominant political order on the planet today, which we're all assuming, all of our asks assume, the resolution assumes, that it's somehow durable or natural or inevitable, that concepts like war should be defined based on the way we've drawn sovereign territorial borders around every part of the land on the planet. But the thing is, there are lots of parts of the globe that do not have clearly defined sovereign territorial borders. You may have heard of the potential of a failed state. Does anyone have an example of a failed state or a possible failed state? Yeah.
Somalia?
Yeah, Somalia is commonly listed. Any other possible failed states? Still going now, but could collapse at any minute that you've heard of? Anybody? Currently strong authoritarian, doesn't have a strong economy to rely on. Greece, potentially, yeah. Although given the neighborhood that it's in, it's somewhat unlikely insofar as, you know, every border is shared with either, well, there's the Mediterranean coastline along Greece where the economy is strong because tourism is strong there. And then there are other borders that are surrounded by relatively stable states. So as long as the neighbor states can secure those borders, I think the possible state failure of Greece would be limited to a more governance failure and then recreation of a new government as opposed to an extended period of chaos. But good thought, yeah.
North Korea?
Yeah, North Korea is the one I was thinking of. Back in 2013 when Kim Jong-il was still alive, cards saying that he was going to have a heart attack any day were all the rage in debate because it gives you a clear trigger moment, and the thought was without his personalistic politics, the state might collapse. Those kinds of war scenarios should not be overlooked, but they don't easily fall into the paradigm concept of war as militarized interstate conflict that you tend to see in a lot of the literature. So I don't want you to ignore the possibility of civil war or the peril of failed states, but one problem with those is depending on the neighborhood, depending on the external interests, they are less likely to escalate than wars between strong states, which we tend to call great power wars. So the great powers are a club of powerful, strong states. Who do you think is a great power in the world today? Yeah.
United States.
Yeah, United States, what do you got?
China.
China, yeah?
EU.
The EU, whether or not they're a state, is an open question. I would say that Germany is a great power, the UK is a great power, France is a great power, mostly because it has nuclear weapons, although they do have interventionary forces. But the EU as a unit has not centralized in terms of security and defense policy. So it actually makes more sense to say that NATO is an example of great powers coming together to act in unison, which we'll talk about NATO in a few slides. But the EU would not go to war together, is the bottom line. But so those 3 EU states I listed, we got the United States, China, who else? Yeah.
Russia.
Russia, yeah. Anybody else want to make a proposal? Yeah.
Germany?
Yeah, I already listed Germany.
Sorry.
So I think that's a pretty good survey of the possible great powers. Depending on how you're defining great power, if it's economically, you could potentially include Brazil or South Africa. Oh, India is also commonly thought of as a great power. So when we say great power war, it doesn't necessarily imply nuclear power versus nuclear power, but it does imply big, strong, stable state with well-funded military against another one of the same. Does anyone think they can name all 9 nuclear weapon states? Yeah.
The U.S.
Yeah.
Russia.
Mm-hmm.
China.
Mm-hmm.
France.
Yeah.
Let's see. Israel.
Yeah. Although they won't admit it.
They won't admit it, but it's true. And
You missed one on the Security Council, I think. So who'd you say? U.S., China, Israel,
Russia.
Russia. Missed 2 from the Security Council.
Oh boy. Oh, France.
What do you got?
Britain.
Britain, yeah.
India, Pakistan. Did we say Russia?
Yes, we did. This one's a risk of state failure.
North Korea.
North Korea, yeah, they don't have very many. I think they have enough uranium right now, or it's plutonium for like 7 or 8 bombs. But they have had a successful test of a nuclear weapon, and that's sort of the bright line between states that are sort of potentially proliferating. Like students often commonly misname Iran as a nuclear state, which with the deal coming out today hopefully will not happen. But North Korea counts because they've had a successful nuclear test, as have all those other states. Good, it's like a personal pet peeve of mine that students are not taught who has nuclear weapons. Okay, so I need to move on from the types of war slide, but I want to point out that accidental war is a particular category of war that spans the other categories. So a civil war, a great power war, they could be catalyzed by an accident, but an accidental war is particularly dangerous because misinterpretation plus the fact that state militaries operate with a standard operating procedure. They're a very rigid bureaucracy with a particular chain of command, with a particular set of things to do, ways to react to situations, that this is a particularly dangerous category of war. And as a result of the way it escalates, I think a particularly strategic kind of advantage or disadvantage impact scenario to claim. We rarely see these kinds of wars. I'll talk about why in terms of democracies eventually. There are imperial wars still that are about gaining resources, gaining control, gaining influence, but they're not openly imperial the way they were in the age of European expansion. And we don't see much reciprocal WMD use. Can anyone name recent historical examples of weapons of mass destruction being used? Yeah.
Wasn't there like chemical weapons being used in Syria?
Yeah, chemical weapons used in Syria and also in Iraq in the 90s. Anybody got an example of a biological weapon being used? Yeah?
There anthrax, but I'm not sure where it was being used.
Yeah, and it wasn't state to state. Actually, the anthrax attacks in the United States, so those happened after 9/11. It was like November 2001. Does anyone know who sent the anthrax? We didn't find out for years, and then it wasn't well reported. Yeah.
Wasn't it some dude within the United States?
Yes, his name was Dr. Bruce Ivins. He worked at Fort Detrick in Maryland, producing biological weapons for defensive purposes for the United States. And he was worried that the United States military was going to stop giving the anthrax vaccine to people in the military. An anthrax vaccine that he happened to have a patent on, so personal interest and security interest. So he sent anthrax to members of Congress, and it got lost and went to some random people, and it killed postal workers because it got out in the postal sorting machines. And then he eventually committed suicide when they were closing in on him. But the way they found him was he had sent letters from the same mailbox in Princeton where he sent the anthrax letters. He also sent a bunch of creepy letters to sorority girls, and they traced it to the same mailbox and figured out that it was him, which is really, really interesting because for several years the anthrax attacks were blamed potentially on Saddam Hussein, potentially on terrorists, and even once the FBI started closing in on Bruce Ivins, in the popular consciousness, the anthrax attacks could have still served as a way to justify a sort of retaliatory interventionist war, as they did serve to justify in the minds of the public the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, at the very least a little bit. It added to the fear that gave public support for those interventions. So even though we talk about WMD all the time, we rarely, if ever, see it used reciprocally by one state to another, and then by that state back to the first state. Okay. Some treaties you need to be aware of. I'm not going to list them. These areas of the globe have been declared nuclear weapons free. Low risk of proliferation in these areas of the globe. You hopefully know by now that proliferation means the spread of nuclear weapons either vertically within one state building up its arsenal or horizontally to other regions. I do talk about Africa. I'm not going to talk about South America. I think that there is a risk of potentially of state failure or internal war, maybe state-to-state skirmishes, but in terms of escalation and drawn, there's a very low risk. I'm also not going to talk about Australia and Southeast Asia, with the exception of the South China Sea. Although Central Asia, despite it being nuclear weapons free, you can see it's that little blob on the top to the left. I think there is a risk of war there, so I am going to talk about that particular region. Okay, some generic arguments about war. As I said, great power war is a common scenario or set of scenarios, I think for two reasons. Number one, you got a big escalatory risk. These are often between states that either have nuclear weapons or are allied with states with nuclear weapons. And number two, there's a lot of generic IR theory type of arguments. As I believe someone over here mentioned that one of your impact scenarios, I think on the economy advantage, was that it would spark a general war because one power is declining and the other power is rising. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple of slides. It's called power transition theory. But basically there are a lot of internal links and a lot of strong escalation arguments about great power wars. There's a common set of scenarios. However, the IR academic literature has produced a lot of defense against great power war scenarios generally. And you've probably heard a couple of these, but I really don't think they're taken fully advantage of. So the first one comes from the Steven Pinker book. He's a professor in psychology at Harvard. It's called The Better Angels of Our Nature. And it's actually really good defense against any violence scenario that is above the level of like domestic violence. Because he makes the argument that in general, violence has been decreasing across the last 5 centuries, and especially interstate wars, and especially great power wars have been decreasing. And he lists a lot of possible reasons why this is the case. He goes into psychology a little bit. He talks about the development of capitalism, but he provides statistics. And statistics allow you to make a strong empirical argument. You can say it is empirically denied that this is a probable scenario. Pinker puts the probability like below 10% or whatever. So his chapters are divided based on level of violence. He goes down from all the way down to domestic violence and all the way up to interstate great power nuclear war, and provides a lot of statistics. So that would be an easy book to mine from your school's library. The second book is by Ressa and O'Neill. It won the Book of the Decade award in the largest IR organization in the world, and it's called Triangulating Peace. And the reason it's triangulating peace is they're trying to explain Pinker's conclusion that interstate war is decreasingly likely, and especially great power war. And they say, they do statistical tests, and they say there are 3 major explanations. So for you, 3 strong warrants to the claim that great power war will never happen. And they're liberal IR theory type of arguments. So if you're making this type of argument, you're saying, I'm not a realist, I'm a liberal, because I believe in commercial peace theory. Commercial peace theory is the argument that economic interdependence prevents war. What do you think is the warrant for that claim? Economic interdependence prevents war. Yeah?
It increases the cost of war because if you rely on things like exports to another country for your economy, then you're probably not going to go to war with them because that war would destroy your economy.
Yeah, absolutely right. The only thing that I would add a little nuance to is the claim of increasing costs, because specifically it increased the domestic costs for a government to make that choice, because the industry would be pissed, the people would be angry. And so I think that one common mistake that debaters make when they're talking about the reasons why we would and would not go to war is they don't disaggregate the way that the state calculates its own national interest. Because the state, especially a democratic state, has to manage all these different potentially conflicting domestic interests. So the military-industrial complex, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, might really want a conflict. But maybe that conflict will be bad for the transnational shipping industry and for the fishing industry and for the large immigrant populations that have an interest in that region. And so the question of whether or not commercial ties would hold back the state is not exactly easy to answer, because different states have different domestic interests that their governments are beholden to. But in general, Russett and O'Neill say that globalization has increased overall economic interdependence, which has changed the cost-benefit calculations of states. Does anyone have a guess about what the D and DPT means? Blank peace theory? Yeah.
Democratic?
Yeah, so do you know the warrant to the claim democracies do not go to war?
No.
Anyone have an idea of why democracies are less likely to go to war or go to war with one another? Yeah?
Is this just because, like, generally democracies have fairly strong ties with each other in terms of, like, political ideology, so they would be more likely to be allies?
That's definitely one part of the reason. You could describe it as commonality in political culture. Also part of that is transparency of the political system, that we can see how Great Britain is making decisions because they've got their version of C-SPAN. They make public statements all the time. It's not closed-door decision-making. That's definitely true, and that warrant supports the claim that democracies are less likely to go to war with other democracies. And that version of democratic peace theory, that democracies don't fight each other, is really well established. There's a lot of consensus by that, and there are other reasons to back up that claim. The claim that democracies are less likely to go to war in general with anyone was initially well supported, but since then a lot of authors have picked at the statistical support for that claim. Basically the numbers had been slightly fudged in a way that made it seem slightly more true, but in reality democracies do often go to war with non-democracies that they have strategic interests in controlling or invading. But some of the other reasons democracies don't go to war with each other would still hold back democracies from attacking other states. So for example, the slow decision-making process. The fact that we have a separation of powers means that the president can't just decide we're going to go full-scale to war. Now there are some nuances. The president can commit some troops for some amount of time without congressional approval, but ultimately the decision-making is divided, it's conflictual between parties, it's public, which slows everything down and makes it more difficult for democratic governments who want to go to war to take advantage of opportunistic scenarios. Another reason is just that the government officials are held accountable to the people by elections, and the people tend to not like it when their sons and daughters or when their parents go off to war. So they're more likely to vote against leaders who get us into wars. And then the third reason is just the norm of territorial conquest has changed. Back in 1850, if Russia invaded Crimea and was like, we just want this port, we just want this access, which by the way, there was a Crimean War about that time, nobody would have really blinked an eye, because that was the age of imperial wars where there was not a strong norm against territorial conquest. Now Russia invades Crimea and it's like, hold on. You're violating all the rules and norms of the international system. This is totally illegal. It's not okay. And Russett and O'Neill make the argument that these norms have actually held states back because they feel like they can't handle the international opprobrium that would come with just invading whoever they want. So this book has accolades. It's got statistics. It cites other books that you can cite, and I think this is a really strong argument that you could make against a war like a US-China war, a US-Russia war, a Russia-China-India war. Any great power scenario, this book provides a lot of arguments against. Both of these top books also draw on this third argument Full disclosure, Judy is my advisor, so I have to, insert him into every lecture. He and Eikenberry, you've read that Eikenberry, Brooks, and Woolforth card probably, which makes the claim that great power war is possible, would you say? Somebody update me on the content of that card. What does that card say? Brooks, Eikenberry, Woolforth, 13, right? Nobody? You don't just like have it on your computer? You can just read the tagline to me?
It's like hedges and impact filter results for everything.
Yeah, okay, so, right, thank you for the reminder. So, Eikenberry writing with Woolforth and Brooks is going to focus on hegemony. Eikenberry writing with Dewdney, and they've got several joint publications, are going to focus on the nuclear aspect of hegemony preventing war. Not just the US having nuclear weapons, but the existence of non-nuclear weapons states. They make an argument, they don't use this term except conversationally, for a Pax Atomica. You may have heard of Pax Romana, the argument that the Roman Empire sort of created order in the region and prevented wars from recurring and recurring and recurring. Their argument is that we've entered the long peace because nuclear deterrence has been effective and is going to continue being effective. So the existence of nuclear weapons prevents their use. That's their argument. However, despite all this IR academic literature, you still get articles like this all the time. And I've got a bunch of screenshotted headlines throughout the lecture. They're all from June or July. And the US military, they want to cover all their bases. They want to, be prepared for any potential threat. And so they're more likely to take a more concerned view than IR academics because it is in their interest to not miss anything, and because they focus so much on military buildup as opposed to, for instance, a government's interaction with its domestic population. And in their mind, the risk of great power war is rising. And I think the general reason comes from what I mentioned before, power transition theory. Has anyone heard of power transition theory or have an idea of what it is? Yeah.
It's like, for example, if you're talking on the basis of soft power, if US soft power goes down, a lot of people argue, like, theoretically, that other countries, like China, their soft power would go up. It's kind of like a zero-sum theory.
You're right on zero-sum. I've never heard of it used in the context of soft power because power transition theory originally came from the realists. They're interested in material forms of power. And a soft power argument would be more what a liberal would focus on. And I think that Joseph Nye, who coined the concept of soft power, would probably not support the idea that it's zero-sum in general. It might be zero-sum in particular issue areas. But you essentially are right insofar as power transition theory is the argument that as hegemons reach power parity, they're more likely to go to war. So if the reigning hegemon, also potentially called the unipole, like the United States, is declining in power, as China is rising in power, there will be a point, argue the power transition theorists, where China is pissed that it has to live in a world created by the United States. All the major dominant international institutions, the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, all created by the US and its allies, and that's the system China has to operate in. So the argument, as the power transition theorists offer, is that as China gets closer to where the US is, there's going to be a moment of opportunity where they're going to strike, or a moment where the US starts to feel insecure and they're going to strike in order to either regain the original order or totally change the order and put China on top. So the reason power transition theory is sort of in the back of the minds of policymakers, members of the media, military strategists, is both because of the rise of China, but also because of the decline of Russia. So as you know, during the Cold War, we were bipolar. After the Cold War, people claimed that it was a unipolar world where there was only one hegemon because Russia didn't have its military shit together. But Russia still has a relatively powerful military, a lot of strategic resources like oil and natural gas, and a lot of nuclear weapons. So it hasn't fallen so far as where China has risen to. And so people argue that Russia will lash out to try and regain its hegemonic status as it's declining. There's lots of reasons why Russia's declining. We could talk about that in the Russia war scenarios. So anyway, great power war as a concept is back in the media, yeah.
So why would Russia lash out at China? Because it seems like they're kind of doing joint operations with regard to economic stuff and kind of not in any such sort of situation where a war would be necessary?
I don't think Russia would lash out with China. I think Russia would prefer an alliance with China, and I'm not sure where it ended up, but they had some intense negotiations over a gas pipeline earlier this year, and the desire was to solidify the Chinese market so Russia wasn't so reliant on the European market. In terms of Russia, I would say the lash out would be more likely to occur in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, potentially the Middle East, because they have interest in all of those places. And the incentive is to try and regain a sphere of influence, which could include markets, it could include resources, to basically bolster their overall global profile, and also their military security, which could be based on basing, it could be based on access to particular transportation infrastructure. So the lash out concept still applies even if they're not lashing out against great powers, because the reason is still to prevent their decline in power. But good question. All right, so sorry, I'm getting bogged down on my slides as I predicted. I think another generic defensive argument that you can and should make is that even if a war is started, it's not going to escalate. I think there's evidence out there that makes this claim. I don't think you need that evidence to make a strong analytic argument that it would not be rational. Leaders are not stupid, they are not impulsive, they are not emotional. They make decisions together, so it's more like an institution making a cost-benefit analysis and choosing whether or not to go up that escalatory ladder. And so the argument is, even if one nuclear weapon falls, there is no reason why we would retaliate with another nuclear weapon. It's called self-deterrence sometimes. The argument is that nuclear deterrence is so strong, it doesn't matter if weapons have already gone off and people have already died. And there's definitely a lot of actual literal hotlines where leaders can call leaders to make sure that emotions and misinformation does not take over. So I think you should make that argument against every single war scenario, that you might be able to prove that it starts, but you cannot prove that it leads to the ultimate impact. All right, I think a good war scenario argument includes this element, the idea that there is a spark or a trigger, a threshold after which you pass, it is difficult to go back. I think it matters because it describes escalation as path dependence. This is sort of your answer to the analytic defensive argument against escalation, where you say that there is a point beyond which the pressure to retaliate would be so strong that even if leaders regretted that they were in this situation, they cannot go back to the way that things were before the situation started. A spark or trigger event means that decision making has to happen faster. So an example of a spark or trigger event would be like Russia putting boots on, or excuse me, China putting boots on the ground in Taiwan, or Russia putting boots on the ground in Ukraine. Or a nuclear weapon going off in Kashmir at the border of India and Pakistan. Now, potentially, this would not trigger escalation, but what it is going to do is change the way decisions are made. The decisions are more likely to be made swiftly, more likely to be made by the military and in secret. And when that's the case, those sort of democratic peace theory type obstacles or commercial peace theory type obstacles aren't going to operate as effectively. One issue with a spark or trigger that can either help or hurt you, depending on what side of the war scenario you're on, is that there's a lot of perception involved. And the spark or trigger event is a critical element in the escalation of an accidental war scenario, because whether or not we are self-deterred from retaliation or we just go straight to full-scale war depends on how the event is interpreted, whether or not it's interpreted as an accident, whether or not it triggers standard operating procedure such that military personnel, even if they don't want to retaliate, are sort of forced by their bureaucratic position to retaliate. So I think when you're describing your war scenario, you want to have a clear warrant for why there is a trigger or a threshold that once you cross, you can't go back. And you want to have a clear warrant for how the other side that's going to participate in the escalation will perceive that initial event. All right, ways that wars get amplified. The first is alliance systems. Here you got the 28 NATO member countries. NATO has done something interesting where they're getting together and they're trying to define what cyber war is, because there's not a clear, or there up until now, has not been a clear threshold beyond which NATO says, oh, okay, all these cyber attacks, those are war now. Now that calls in the alliance system, because the NATO alliance is an agreement that we will all defend each other if one of us has to go to war. So they need to define cyber war because, for example, these Baltic states up here, in 2007, Estonia had all its banking computers shut down, and its government computers started having problems. And it's been concluded now that it was a massive cyber attack by Russia. Estonia is a NATO country. Depending on what the cyber attack does, if it's a declared cyber war by NATO, that triggers a bunch of responses by those other NATO countries. So that's an interesting element of cyber war escalating to other war, is how NATO, the alliance system, might be drawn in once something is declared a war. You also got the hub and spoke alliance system. Has anyone heard this phrase before? Do you know what alliance system I'm talking about? Anyone? Do you know what a hub and spoke is? Yeah.
Where it's like alliances radiate out from a certain country, but they're not all like interconnected like they are with NATO.
Exactly. Is this yeah. So the U.S. is the hub? Yeah, hub. And the spokes are its bilateral alliances. This describes our alliance system in East Asia. Can anyone name the U.S.'s allies in the Asian region? Anybody? U.S. Just one U.S. ally. Someone over here. Someone the U.S. is friends with. South Korea, definitely. What do you got?
Japan.
Japan, definitely. I would say those are our two best friends of the region. You got another idea?
Taiwan.
Taiwan, yeah, okay. Maybe, it's a best friends club of 3. But they don't like each other. That's why it's a hub and spoke system. But we're very close with all 3 of them. Other allies in South, yeah.
Maybe Philippines.
Yeah, the
maybe
Philippines,
Vietnam.
Increasingly Vietnam, but definitely more so the Philippines than Vietnam. That's important because of your South China Sea impact scenario, which we'll talk about in a minute. But that's the biggest way that the U.S. would be drawn into an East Asian or Southeast Asian war, because it has a close bilateral alliance relationships with all these states. Whether or not NATO is more dangerous or our alliances in East Asia are more dangerous for the United States is kind of an open question, because NATO has the problem of having 28 member states that are all committed to each other. But the hub and spoke system has the downside of the U.S. being connected to states that might be in conflict with one another, might have different types of conflict with China. I'm talking specifically about South Korea and Japan here, who do not at all get along, and who we are very close with and have troops stationed in both of those countries. All right, another amplifier for war is domestic nationalism. You see this especially in these 3 countries listed here. China and Japan will often stoke domestic nationalism, especially over the South China Sea or East China Sea issues, in order to build up their domestic support. You got to remember, governments are always doing things based on external events, but also based on internal domestic needs. And so if domestic nationalism is strong when that spark goes off, the public could push the government to a war that they don't think is actually in their interest internationally. But because everyone's been rallying around the flag, because all the domestic nationalism has sort of reached a fever pitch, the government might have to do it because of domestic reasons, even if internationally it doesn't really make sense. And so you can see how domestic nationalism might push the government sort of over the edge into escalating a war, even if they think that it's not in their commercial interests or that they might ultimately lose. So domestic nationalism is really dangerous in terms of amplifying wars, especially, I think, wars with Russia and in East Asia with those 2 folks. Another amplifier is, who do you blame? This is the notion of a catalytic war, which can be intentional or unintentional. You read that ACEN evidence, it's like the U.S. will retaliate. There's a lot of IR academic evidence, anyway, that suggests that a non-state actor might purposefully attack a state actor in order to frame another state actor, because a state-on-state war might be in their interest. And so this is the question of, would the terrorists purposefully start a catalytic war where they don't care about getting retaliated, or they do care about getting retaliated against, but they know that they will not be blamed. So a solid example, I think, is the eternal link of loose nukes. So if a group got nuclear weapons from an insecure Russia, or a meddling Iran that gives Hezbollah nuclear weapons, or an insecure Pakistan, they might purposefully allow those weapons to be traced back to that country because they want to spark a war between that country and the United States. The other issue is when it's a non-state actor, like for instance any of Al-Qaeda's organizations or ISIS or something, that there might not be a clear state to retaliate against. So the United States or other victims of terrorism. China has an issue, and so does Russia, with Islamic fundamentalist terrorism, and also internal terrorism issues too, and they call it terrorism. I'm not necessarily saying those are actual terrorists. They blame non-state actors as committing terrorist attacks against them, that it might cause a retaliation against multiple state targets, and you don't know how those multiple state targets are going to respond. Anyone know what the phrase fait accompli means? Anybody? This is how people say that China will attack Taiwan if it does. It's basically doing something so fast that by the time you realize it's done, you can't effectively react to it. And so that is supposedly the way China will attack Taiwan, because it's poised to attack Taiwan, it's practiced attacking Taiwan, it's geographically close to Taiwan. So the argument goes that China makes the decision that it wants to attack Taiwan. If it has a narrow window and it's rising as a power, it is investing in its navy every single year, it might reach a point where it's decided, okay, now's my moment, I'm going to attack, and then the U.S. response is made so much more difficult by the fact that China is already sort of within the Taiwanese territory, within the Taiwanese political system, so that civilians would become a necessary collateral damage. So that's definitely one of those potential escalation sparks or escalation triggers where it's not going to be one bomb for one bomb for two bombs, three bombs, but rather it's going to be all of a sudden war. Because there's a strategic advantage to all of a sudden starting a war. All right. NATO. I was trying to think of links on this topic. As I said, it's ever present, it's inevitable. There's no guarantee against war, so war scenarios will always arise on topics. Like I said, there's an uncertain relationship with cyber war. Whether or not cyber war triggers a conventional or a WMD, even a nuclear response, is really sort of up in the air, especially the relationship between alliance security commitments and cyber war is kind of up in the air. That's good for you as a debater because it means there's lots of speculative evidence about when we would have to or when we would be forced to retaliate to a cyber war in a certain way. I've already talked about catalytic war. I think that the only problem with this scenario, which is a really good internal link to a state-to-state war, is that we've been attacked a lot and haven't retaliated. Like the ASIN card is definitely empirically denied. If you think about how many NATO countries have been attacked by people claiming they were working for Al-Qaeda or they were working for ISIS and we did not retaliate. So I think that you should be making that argument more. And then, as I said, power transition theory just suggests that there's always a risk of great power war, because if a great power that is rising sees an opportunity, perhaps that opportunity is the U.S. intelligence has taken a giant hit because it can no longer surveil its domestic population, or it can no longer surveil information that is going through our telecommunications cables. They might take that as an opportunity to have a fait accompli type attack. And then also you just got the general rising power interest in changing the world order. So it's important in terms of your uniqueness to consider rising power's perception of their own rising power. Like, is China going to act aggressively because is it confident, or is it not confident that its military could achieve some regional strategic objective? All right, going into the specific wars here. Are there any questions? Am I missing any questions? Okay, I think U.S.-China war, there's a lot of literature about, but there are strong liberal barriers to it insofar as we have economic interdependence, strong economic interdependence. However, the potential links all have to do in some way or another, with the exception of North Korea, I suppose, with sovereignty claims. So are you all familiar with the South China Sea dispute? Yeah, so can someone give me a basic summary of what's going on in the South China Sea? Somebody other than this dude? Yeah, we got it. Sorry.
The South China Sea right now is China is claiming to have like sovereign territory of almost all the entire South China Sea, and it includes a bunch of islands claimed by like the Philippines, Malaysia, and all like the other countries in the area.
Mm-hmm.
And it's
Do you
causing
know the
like,
name of those islands?
I don't actually know what to say.
What do you got?
Japan calls them Senkakus, China calls
Nope,
them.
that's the East China Sea.
Oh,
We're talking South China Sea. We'll get to
Paracel.
the East China Sea. You got the Paracel Islands,
Spratly.
Spratly Islands. You got the last one? There's that.
I don't know.
Scarborough Shoal is the other one. A lot of them, the UN law of the sea is unclear on whether or not they count as islands yet. So China's just going to go ahead and make them islands. This is what China has been doing in the last couple of months. This is a photo that was taken by the Philippine Coast Guard. They're basically building the islands so they can build infrastructure on them. Arguably, this is a fait accompli type strategy to claim the South China Sea islands. But you got it essentially right in that China is claiming all of them and has disputes with different states for different islands. China's, I wish I had gotten up a map, sorry. China's claiming this 9 dotted line. It's this big U that goes below China's southern border. All the islands fall within it. There are strong disputes with Vietnam over here, with the Philippines over here. Also Malaysia, Brunei, Taiwan, they're also involved. But the strongest dispute that's been most active involves Vietnam and the Philippines. The East China Sea conflict is with Japan. You're right, there are 2 different names for the islands. Can you share those names again?
Japan calls them senkakus, China calls them gyeogyudao.
Yeah, do you know why they care?
It's like military bases, I don't know.
Anybody, why do they care? Yeah.
Is there oil there, or is that the South China Sea?
There's oil and just general fossil fuel deposits under both. Fisheries are also an interest. Shipping lanes are an interest. Just general sovereignty, sphere of influence type stuff is an interest. Domestic nationalism is related to this. There are historical claims. Anyway, China's definitely acting in both, insofar as you've got the island building in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. You remember that aerial defense zone they claimed that was basically like, if you're going to fly over these islands, you better tell us or we're going to shoot you down. So they're sort of slowly moving out influence-wise. What are the U.S. interests in the South and East China Sea? Why do we care? Yeah.
Maybe we want to deter China.
Why do we care about that?
Because we don't want them to be like a rising power and challenge us.
Yeah, any other reasons? I mean, it's kind of a trick question because that's just like a general, diffuse answer. I mean, you could say that about any potential rising China. Like, the U.S. doesn't want Brazil to have a strong economy. The U.S. doesn't like it when India builds nuclear submarines. That's true. But whether or not the U.S. would get involved in a conflict just because it doesn't want China to be strong is sort of an important threshold question. But the easy answer is alliance reasons, because the U.S. is committed to defending the Philippines and Japan and Taiwan against a possible conflict. I already talked about the fait accompli strategy with Taiwan. China claims sovereignty issues are a core national interest, which means it is not held back by the norms against territorial conquest that I talked about as part of the Russett and O'Neill book. Although it is held back by economic interdependence, it's not held back by democratic peace theory either, because it has a very centralized decision-making process when it comes to military conflict. What's the risk of war over North Korea? Anybody? Well, it could collapse at any moment. It could start its own war with South Korea, although there seems to be very little incentive for doing so. China's fear is twofold. Number one, a wave of North Korean refugees over its border. If you escape North Korea, almost every single person who has done it over the border with China because it's less secure. If North Korea collapsed, there would be a giant wave of refugees into China. And number two is, if the Korean countries are united on the Korean Peninsula, South Korea is BFF with the United States, and China doesn't want the U.S. right up on its border that's currently its border with North Korea. And so if North Korea collapsed, or if North Korea started a conflict with South Korea or Japan, which is constantly sort of making claims that it will do at any moment, then the U.S. would probably get involved and China would probably get involved, but their incentive for getting in conflict with one another is very, very low. So that could trigger some kind of accidental escalation potentially. I've already talked about domestic politics. They're very strong in China. They're very attached to these sovereignty issues. They're very attached to the military. And then you've got the generic argument that you just made, sir, which is that China wants to revise the international system where it is the hegemon, where it builds regional and global order, in which case it might take any possible opportunity to start a fight that it thinks it can win because of two things. Number one, the fait accompli strategy, and number two, the anti-access area denial strategy. You might see AT or A2AD in the literature you read about the South China Sea. Does anyone know what that strategy is? Yeah.
I know it generally has to do with like China wanting to deny the U.S. the ability to like move around their military units by utilizing sort of like geographical things with the South China Sea. So like it's sort of shallow in nature, and also it's like it's very like noisy in terms of like submarines, so it makes it harder for like submarines to be detected and stuff like that.
What do you want to do when you grow up?
I'm not sure yet.
You should get a PhD in IR. Yes, that was a perfect summary. China doesn't care if it can trounce us in an all-out nuclear war. It cares that it can keep us out of Southeast Asia. And the way that the local geography interacts with submarine technology makes that a possibility for them. Now, China's Navy is weak, it's old, it's stupid, it's incapable, but it is getting stronger and more capable every single day. And also, as I said, there's an advantage, a defensive advantage for submarines because Southeast Asia is a littoral maritime environment, which means a couple of things. There's a bunch of shallow areas, there's tons of shipping traffic, so there's lots of ambient noise. It gets very dense in places. It's difficult for a submarine to get in without being attacked by other submarines that are hiding around it, is the basic story. Our submarines are more powerful, they're quiet, they're armed with nuclear weapons, but China has a bunch of old attack submarines that can hide from us easily because of the littoral environment. Whether or not China's achieved this ultimate goal yet is an open question. Probably the answer is no. Whether or not they're trying to achieve it is a closed question. Yes, they definitely are, and they're very public and open about that. That interacts with the pivot to Asia that has been declared but not really followed through on, with the exception of we have a major naval base in Guam, which is where we would launch a counterattack from, where we would get involved from, that has, back when I was in 2010, I had an app that was about rotating nuclear weapons through Guam. I'm really not sure if that's happening anymore, given 5 years later. But anyway, that's how the conflict would go down. We'd send our forces from Guam. China would try and keep us out, but wouldn't necessarily attack us back in Guam or anywhere else the U.S. has military bases, because they want that to be their solid zone of influence. We've already talked about the alliance politics that might draw the U.S. in. We've already talked about these barriers and non-barriers. A wild card that's related to domestic nationalism, you probably read that really racist sounding Renexine 5 card. That's like the CCP will lash out because it fears its own survival. It's definitely a reasonable argument that the CCP, what does CCP stand for? Yeah. That if they're afraid that they will, and it's not just the CCP as a whole, it could be a particular cadre of leaders in the CCP that fears an internal coup within the party or against the party or a general collapse. Probably not going to be a pro-democracy movement, but potentially that they might lash out to rally around the flag and have people basically make the argument, I can't challenge the government because this is a time of war, which definitely really happens during times of war. There also could be chain of command failures. Has anyone seen the movie Dr. Strangelove? So what's the chain of command failure that happens there? Who starts the war?
Oh boy, it's been a while. It was like this crazy general who started attacking.
Exactly, crazy general. So somebody who has control over the weapons, that's not getting an order from higher up, but wants to start a catalytic war, that could happen on our side or on their side. But we're more familiar with our chain of command, and we'll probably, people writing the literature will have more concerns about their chain of command. And then also you got the alliance drawn issue. You never know when Japan might start a war with China potentially. Like I said, China's military is far inferior to the United States, especially when it comes to the Air Force and the Navy. However, cyber capability-wise, arguably China is more capable. It's really hard to say because we don't know what's going on behind the scenes, and also because the offense-defense balance in cyber weapons is still being worked out. It's still sort of, as technology advances, the barriers to cyber attacks and the possibilities of cyber attacks are constantly changing in terms of which is more powerful. So arguably the Chinese military could become very cyber capable very quickly depending on how they invest in cyber technology, how that technology changes, etc. So I think that US-China war, I'm going to go with unlikely now, but possible in the future. All right, US and Russia. Tons of literature on a US-Russia war because we spent the entire Cold War thinking about it. The nuclear force structure, you know, you've probably heard of the nuclear triad. Where do we base nuclear weapons? There's three, yeah.
Land-based, air-based, and then submarine-based.
Yeah, those are the three triad. That is built up around the possibility of a nuclear war with Russia, where our bases are, where their bases are, the fact that our nuclear deterrence strategy relies on submarines. That's all based on preparing for a giant war with Russia. We have rough nuclear parity in terms of number of warheads. The US and Russia together have produced 98% of the nuclear weapons that have ever existed on the Earth. Some of those have been dismantled, but as it stands now, they are the #1 and #2 nuclear power in terms of number of warheads by the thousands. Who do you think is #3 in terms of number of nuclear weapons? Yeah, how many do you think they have, China? Keep in mind the US has probably like 2,500 that are actively, available.
Get a few hundred.
That was like 80.
That I think is
Israel has
Israel
like
and or
60,
France. The answer is around 240. We're not sure, but it's not above 300. So China, number 3 nuclear power, has way, 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 way less. Now, our nuclear weapons are totally overkill. That number of nuclear weapons would destroy the entire planet and everyone on it. But the point is, China might feel like they have parity hegemony-wise because they have nuclear parity, even though their delivery systems, which are necessary for making a nuclear warhead really worth anything strategically, are definitely crumbling and underfunded. The realists make this argument. Well, you don't necessarily have to be a power transition theorist to make this argument that a declining power will lash out to secure its own domestic power and to sort of build up a sort of buffer of strategic influence. You can see that happening in Eastern Europe. Russia and Putin especially, I mean, lashing out to gain territory for strategic security purposes can be referred to as a kind of classical geopolitics. It's basically the opposite of liberal internationalism. And Russia, the way it talks, suggests that Putin really behaves in that way. I mean, Russia's economy and its government revenue is significantly dependent on fossil fuels that it sells to Europe. I mean, it cares about resources, geography, and material power. So there are reasons to believe that Russia would be a little bit more militaristic, especially because economic interdependence is less true between the US and Russia as between the US and China, although Russia does have a strong economic relationship with the EU. Putin and a horse. If you're going to talk about Putin, you just got to throw in a Putin picture, Why the US and Russia wouldn't go to war? We learned our lesson in the Cuban Missile Crisis. We set up hotlines. We have socialized one another in terms of nuclear signaling. We came up with the concept of deterrence theory and exchanged it and had our force structures reflected together with Russia when they were the Soviet Union. We've de-escalated a bunch of times. There have been a bunch of scenarios where something was misinterpreted as a missile heading over. There was even at least one point where the Russian sort of person that was supposed to press the button was supposed to press the button and sort of start up the escalatory ladder. Standard operating procedures said he should have pressed the button, but he said he just had an uneasy feeling, and so he didn't. And so there have been scenarios where we've stepped back even though you would have expected escalation. Also, Putin is not as strong as he talks in terms of the actual military capability, and it's really possible that it's all domestic nationalism that's causing him to bark and not bite so much, although Ukraine is an obvious counterexample. The Ukraine example can be used to make lots of different arguments about Russia. This is the way Russia sees the map of Crimea and Ukraine. This is the Russian Empire back in the 1850s. In terms of the Ukraine conflict, I really don't think the US is going to get involved because there's not a direct national interest. They see it as an issue for the EU. Although with the 2016 elections coming up, depending on who wins, depending on how the primaries go, a victory or the election itself could trigger a policy change. Has anyone heard the term October surprise? Nobody? October surprise? Yeah.
It's like saying that something that wasn't, or it's like kind of like the dark horse thing. Something that wasn't supposed to happen.
Why does October matter?
Isn't it like before?
Yeah, the elections are in November. A big change that happens right before the election, sometimes purposefully done by the president or purposefully done by a candidate in order to change their election prospects. Militarism is a good possible example because of that rally around the flag fact. If there's a war started, people are more likely to support an incumbent president. I mentioned Iran and Syria because we have divergent interests with Russia in those states. Russia is pro-Assad. Russia has been helping Iran build nuclear reactors for nuclear power. However, what did Russia do in 1979 that was a huge mistake? In my American history classes in high school, we never really got up to the 70s, so I can understand why you haven't learned this. Russia invaded Afghanistan, and that was a huge mistake. It was a huge draw on its resources. They got bogged down in the quagmire. There was a lot of conflict they didn't expect. They said, oh, we've been invited in by this new communist power. There had just been a coup by some communists. And anyway, bogged them down. People say it contributed to Russia losing the Cold War because of the resource commitment. So basically, Russia will be very hesitant to put boots on the ground and get more significantly involved in a military way in the Middle East region, even though it could be an easy proxy conflict, given that our opinions about Iran and Syria differ substantially. All right, I'm running out of time. I'm long-winded, I'm sorry. Who has heard an India-Pakistan war scenario? Okay, what was the internal link?
I don't remember.
I was pointing at you.
Climate?
Climate? They go to war.
It's like the Himalayan glaciers melting.
That's kind of long-term. There's not Himalayan glaciers between them, though. That might be in India, China. Anyway, that's fascinating.
I just heard you know something like that.
Okay, they've hated each other for a long time. They've had multiple conflicts. That means there's a strong empirical denied argument for you. They fight over this region, Kashmir. It hasn't escalated multiple times. Potential triggers include terrorist attacks coming from one going to the other. You've probably heard about the Mumbai hotel terrorist attack. Those folks came from Pakistan or came through Pakistan originally. Pakistan is an unstable, very large, very militarized nuclear power. There's always a risk of a coup. There have been military coups in the past. One interesting element is China is making friends with Pakistan fast. And as you might guess, that makes India feel very, very nervous. China is investing hugely in this Gwadar port and building a transportation corridor all the way to and from it, so it doesn't have to send its oil reserves out the Persian Gulf, down around India, up through the South China Sea, right by the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. It won't have to do that anymore because it can just put them here and take them into China that way. So China is getting real buddy-buddy with Pakistan. That's making India nervous. Potentially, I don't really know what would trigger a war except for maybe if China came in on the side of Pakistan for the conflict with India, or Pakistan did something and it was attributed to Chinese meddling. Also potentially, this northwestern region, Waziristan of Pakistan, is very unstable, not particularly controlled by the government. If it started to export extremism to either India or China, which is also subject to Islamic extremism because it subjugates its Uyghur population up into this northwest area. They're a Muslim population that is not the Han Chinese, so they're very significantly different than China culturally, religious-wise. And so potentially if Pakistan exports Islamic fundamentalism to India, which it has, or to China, which it hasn't been blamed on that before, that could start a conflict where these two great powers feel like they need to go in and secure that region to make their citizens safe. I think low risk of conflict between India and Pakistan, yeah.
Do you think there would also be like probability of a conflict over territory or no?
Between India and Pakistan?
Yeah, because I feel like I've seen that internal link before, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's Kashmir is the internal link. It's a region that they've been fighting over since they were originally divided in, gosh, what was it, the 50s or the 60s? Independence didn't come late, or came late for these countries, and originally Pakistan and Bangladesh were one country, and then they separated. So there's just been a lot of historical territorial change. But the reason I don't think Kashmir is subject to an escalation risk is that there have been multiple skirmishes, conflicts, militarized exchanges over Kashmir. I think it's up to 6 in the past. You can easily Google that and find out to make your empirically denied arguments. So unless there's an element of misattribution or some kind of escalation trigger that happens before they have time to think about it, I really don't think that's a plausible scenario personally. This climate thing is really interesting though, given that they are not particularly stable countries, given that India has a lot of resource challenges, that could change things. But India is kind of a wild card in general because they are investing in their blue water military. They do want nuclear submarines. They are militarizing significantly. Nuclear submarines being the crux of nuclear deterrence because you can't find them in the ocean, but you can find and destroy bombers or ballistic missiles. So everyone who wants nuclear deterrence wants nuclear submarines. So sort of where India goes in the next 20 years is kind of an open question in terms of whether or not those liberal obstacles to great power war apply. But I think India is a low risk of great power war personally. Okay, lots of potential triggers for a war between the US and Iran. Obviously, if Iran is seen to be cheating on this deal or has breakout proliferation, gets a nuclear weapon really fast, that could potentially trigger a reactive response by Israel or the United States. Iran could arm Hezbollah for proxy terrorism or arm other terrorist groups. Iran does not like Al-Qaeda. But Iran does like Hezbollah, which we've named a terrorist organization. They probably wouldn't give Hezbollah nuclear weapons because they want control over the use of nuclear weapons. I think low actual probability of them secretly creating a nuclear weapon and secretly giving them to Hezbollah, but I'm sure you could find some cards that say that. People always, there's lots of doom scenarios about just neoconservatives taking over the federal government, winning elections, and making a move that liberals find unwise. But Iran, the threshold for attacking Iran is very high because it's a big-ass country. It's got a powerful, well-organized military relative to other countries in the region, and it's got 77 million people. It's got resources, especially natural gas. It's got friends. It's got a good relationship with Russia. And so the key question in terms of will this war happen is, could it be quick? Because if the U.S. knows it's going to be engaged in a prolonged war with Iran, it's not going to get into that war because it's really not in U.S. interest unless the ideological climate in the federal government changes. I think the most likely scenario, and the one that's written about the most, is an Israeli end around. I think it's a football term. I don't know football. Is it a football term? Anyone know football? End around? You heard that? Anyway, the idea is that Israel will be like, oh, United States, you're so scared. You're not being bold enough. Iran is really terrible. Why are you trying to be friends with Iran? So they're going to force our hand by attacking Iran first, maybe blaming Iran, maybe not, and then just say, oh, you've got an alliance. You better get involved. I think the risk of this, I mean, there was a lot of evidence about it in like 2007, 2008, that Cheney would get Israel to end around the United States. I think the risk might have grown insofar as Israel has been very vocally against this deal with Iran. They're very angry about what the U.S. has done. The recent election in Israel saw a huge victory for the right-wing parties. They refer to, my friend Yoni is writing his dissertation on the concept of ontological security in Israel. And it's based on the idea that Israel perceives itself as, in the region, always being an existential risk because Iran is always like, we're going to wipe you off the map. And so that kind of security politics becomes hyper-militarized really fast because it's seen as an all-or-nothing survival game. Also, Israel might feel like it can attack Iran with impunity. In 1981, Israel attacked Iraq without telling anyone and destroyed a nuclear reactor there. In 2007, they told us, but we didn't say we knew, they did the same thing in Syria. So Israel has twice in the region sent its air force over to destroy nuclear facilities, basically undeclared, basically unadmitted, not always with the knowledge of all its allies. So it might be overconfident and feel like it can do the same with Iraq without starting, or excuse me, in Iran without starting a war. I think this is a badass slide. I like this slide. Okay, I said, what was the population of Iran?
77 million.
Population of Israel, anyone got a guess?
A few million.
Very good, 8 million, very close. However, what military benefit does Israel have?
Nukes.
Yeah, those are two solid answers.
Like 60
Nuclear
something.
weapons, U.S. military support, advanced military technology. A lot of people don't know this, but Israel also has a really strong high-tech economy. And they have a relatively effective localized missile defense, the Iron Dome, which we gave them and funded. But yeah, I mean, I really don't know who would win in a war. Oh, also, what's that circle right there? The red circle that I circled? Yeah, what's in Bahrain?
U.S. military base.
Yeah, the U.S. 5th Fleet Naval Base. So if we got involved in a war in Iraq, that is where we would come from. What is this little thing right here?
Straight of Hormuz.
Yeah, what does that matter?
Oil.
65%.
Yeah, so if Iran shuts it down, that really F's up U.S., or excuse me, global energy markets, skyrockets the price. That could be bad for us, depending on how well fracking is going, I guess. All right, Central Asia. This is Central Asia. You should learn these countries. Nobody knows these countries. The way I remember it, name-wise, is that it goes in alphabetical order, clockwise, so you can remember which one is which. All right, actual risk of war probably low, but there are cards out there that say that the risk is possible. These are all authoritarian states, former Soviet satellites mostly. There's a lot of oil and gas. There's a question of pipelines. I'm pretty sure there's already a pipeline across the Caspian Sea, but Russia's always wanting to build more pipelines. Iran has relationships with these countries up here. It's a legacy sphere of influence insofar as China kind of feels like it's always sort of had a little bit of claim to influence and control over this area. Russia feels the same about this area. Not so much with India and Iran. They're also seen as strategic buffer zones between potential conflict. I mean, look at this. You got your China, your Russia, you got Iran, you got India. It's just surrounded by great powers. Does anyone know about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization? It's a security agreement between China, Russia, and these countries. And it's a reason, arguably, why war wouldn't happen, because it's designed to have security connections between all these regional countries. Also potentially a reason why war would happen, because guess who else is getting involved in this region in terms of oil and gas politics and choosing authoritarian winners and losers?
Yeah.
You got a guess? Who else would meddle? What other great power hegemon wants a bunch of oil?
America.
It's got two thumbs and it's us. So potentially if the US crosses a line of investment, those other great powers who feel like it's their buffer zone, their strategic influence, would get involved. That's the reasons why I think it's unlikely, but it's potentially possible. There's always the Islamic fundamentalism, terrorism export issue. There's also an easy justification for the United States to get involved because they're all authoritarian states, they all oppress their people in one way or another. So if you're talking like as democracy promotion as a justification, it would apply to any of those Central Asian states. Africa, it's just the escalation is unlikely. You could claim a war scenario certainly based on civil war, based on a failed state. It's going to be hard to claim that it escalates to a great power war or a nuclear war. I think there's very little reason why someone would fight a proxy war there. Although the setup exists, there's just like China encroaching into Africa is like huge in the literary market right now. These are just the first 6 books I found with a Google image search of China and Africa. Also, the United States is encroaching in Africa. Some of this is about oil deals, land deals. With the U.S., it's a lot of military bases. The U.S. has Africa Command, is a whole regional military infrastructure. India is also trying to get involved economically, but all authors agree that China is winning the war of influence in Africa. And so it's all about economic interest. Arguably, the great powers have strong strategic interest there, but I just don't see it going anywhere. Does anyone disagree with me on this and wants to propose a likely African war? Well, and the other thing is, in terms of escalation, it's a little bit empirically denied, what with Libya and Egypt having lots of internal problems. All right, I only have 3 slides left in 5 minutes, so I think I can do it. The next 2 are bad internal links that I hear often claim to war. Could someone define saber rattling for me without looking at the slide? Have you heard the phrase saber rattling? Okay, does anyone know what a saber is?
Sword.
Yeah, and if you're rattling it, it's like you're threateningly shaking it. Saber rattling happens all the time. It's as much about domestic signaling as it is internationally signaling. North Korea does it all the time. There was this one, they just shelled this island. They just like had all these mortars explode on this South Korean island. And I think maybe 1 person died in that event, but South Korea was like, what's the point of this? Because it was playing to a domestic audience about their interpretation of international events. That kind of stuff doesn't escalate. You can have all kinds of tests of weapons in 2007. China sat down one of its satellites. The US thought that was really threatening. North Korea has tested and is preparing to test ballistic missiles. Sometimes they will arrest fisher people in the South China Sea. They will harass fishing boats in areas that are disputed. This stuff doesn't escalate. I really don't think it escalates in almost every scenario. It's just a show of strength. The only scenarios in which I think it would escalate is if it is severely miscommunicated why it's happening, how strong an attack it is, or if it's a chain of command issue where the local military leader decides to asymmetrically respond to what was really just a signal of strength. I also think relations, I think in general, relations good, relations bad is a really bad internal link to advantages and disadvantages. The main reason is there's not one big pot of relations where it's like a sort of zero sum and it's all the same. Because 2 qualities of states, as the modern state system defines states, as states see themselves, explain why a relations DA is a bad DA, especially as an internal link to war. The first is that states are functionally differentiated, which means you got your Department of Defense, you got your Department of Commerce, your Department of Transportation, etc. That sectoral differentiation occurs in democratic and authoritarian states, and it means that the network that creates interpersonal relations and trust and cooperative sort of channels happens within those functionally specific parts of the state. So even if we make US telecom companies really, really pissed because China, for instance, is able to take advantage of backdoors and surveil US domestic citizens or something, there's no reason why the US military would respond immediately to low relations that can be defined as primarily commercial or something. So basically you have to prove that the relations that you affect matter as an internal link to military conflict. That also means that decision making is diffuse, that my feeling that China is, for instance, a credible decision maker, a credible, trustworthy partner, if I'm in charge of one aspect of relations with China, I don't give a shit if the military feels differently about China. Oh, I shouldn't curse on video. I don't care at all if relations with China are bad based on somebody else's perception. Another reason is that states, as I mentioned, typically do not react based on motivations like anger or vengeance or rage or anything. They are typically strategic opportunists, which means that low relations are just as likely to be a cause of a conflict as an effect of a conflict or a justification for a conflict. So for instance, the claim that US-Russia relations being terrible means that Putin will invade the rest of Ukraine and spark a war with NATO. You could say that relations are the cause, but you could equally say that Putin wants to do it anyway, and he's claiming low relations are the cause. So if low relations are a symptom or a justification, then that means that the war was inevitable in the first place because they would have justified it a different way. Last slide. Just because you say that there's a war scenario does not necessarily mean that you are a realist. People often think that anyone who talks about state-to-state activity is a realist. Liberals also believe that the state system exists and that it is a primary source of behavior and events in the international community. The core tenets of realism are listed here. States are the primary units, transnational actors, NGOs, religious movements, none of that stuff matters for realists. They think that NATO is the closest you can get to true cooperation, but it's ultimately a fragile alliance. And if it's not in the US's interest to defend its allies, it won't. So realists think that alliance relationships are weak. So if you're claiming that the US gets drawn into a war with China because it will come to defend Japan's back, that's not a realist argument necessarily. If you're claiming it is because the US has a strong commitment to Japan, Japan trusts the United States, and the US feels a personal obligation or a cultural connection to Japan, and that's why they'll get involved, then that is exactly not a realist argument. If you're saying that states act for any other reason than security, maybe it's obligation to co-religionists or something, that is not a realist argument at all. So if you're making any arguments about motivation based on commercial connections, cultural connections, norms, what an institution requires, then none of that is realist. The easy answer to the claim that you're being a realist and that links to RK is you can just say, I don't believe that's how the international system operates, but the military sure does. And so you don't necessarily have to personally commit to the ontological assumptions made by John Mearsheimer. It's enough to prove that foreign policymakers do commit to those assumptions. And there's all kinds of literature that suggests that China and Russia especially act within a realist framework and a realist mindset. So if you want to talk more about that, we can, but I have gone right up to the edge of time. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to ask them. You're welcome to stay, but otherwise you can go to lunch.